Yeah. So today might be a bit longer of a lecture to make up for the shorter one from last week. So I don't know if I might not finish through today. If not, I'll just go over into next week's or the following week's next classes time. But today we'll be talking mostly about the Swiss banking industry, which is one of the definitely the more overhyped parts of Swiss Switzerland, but it's something that most people know of. And we'll go into a little bit about the Swiss economy as well. And then whatever we don't get to in the economy, we'll continue following class. So some basic things about the banking sector is that it's a relatively old banking sector. It started in the 18th century, mostly to hold the mercenary earnings. So, like we talked about back in the history lecture, Switzerland used to provide a lot of mercenaries for the rest of Europe, and that used to earn them a lot of money. And so, it was a way to hold all this money. A few private banks were started in order to hold this wealth so that's where the first two banks started up. And since then, the financial sector compromises 11.6% of the Swiss GDP, which is actually a pretty high percentage. It is lower than the United States' percentage. I think the United States is almost around 20%, but the United States is also, I think, one of the highest. I think it is probably the highest. And so Switzerland is very high up there. And it also employs about 5.6% of the population, which is also relatively very high, except for when compared to countries like the United States. And so, obviously, what most people probably know is just that it's a safe haven for, offshore funds, where a third of the offshore funds in the world, offshore funds is money that is in a country that's different than its origin. So people who are storing money offshores. A third of the world's offshore money supply is held in Switzerland. And so Swiss banks manage about $2.7 trillion in 2007. And another very interesting thing about the society is it's not a very credit-driven society. So, almost 2/5 of the population doesn't even have a credit card. And so, for that reason, the banks actually play a much different role than they do in the U.S. They're mostly for safekeeping and investment rather than funding a credit-driven society. This is kind of the overall structure of the banking system. You have the Swiss National Bank, and then it formally splits up banks into one of these 5 categories. They have this one category that's specifically called the big banks, which is kind of weird. So we'll be talking mostly about first the bottom banks, and then at the end we'll go into some of the stuff about the Swiss National Bank. So the big banks is made up of three banks: Credit Suisse, UBS, and Julius Baer. Julius Baer is actually definitely nowhere close to the size of the first two. The first two, Credit Suisse and UBS, hold over 50% of all the assets, banked assets in Switzerland. So these two are kind of the giants in the banking space, even on the international scale. And so, why is Swiss banking very prevalent? Even before 1934, which is an important year that we'll get into, but even since before then, it was considered a very stable banking country because the Swiss currency is seen as extremely stable. They weren't going to go to war anytime soon, so that way, countries that don't go to war, the economies tend to stay more stable. Swiss banks tend to have a very high gold reserve, so up to 40% usually. On the downside of this, of course, is that if you have higher reserve rates, that means there's less lending going on, which means that you have much lower interest rates. So that's kind of another thing I was saying about the role of banks in their society is much more different. Very high extreme security, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, where keeping the data vaults and stuff in mountain underground, they do the same thing with their gold vaults and everything, and very high levels of personal service. It was considered a very the Swiss bankers would come to you, and they'd often take on roles much larger than just banking itself. like help you with investment, like literally like deliver, like buy, like for example, like there's an example I'll go into, like they'll literally go out and buy diamonds for you and like deliver them to you as like part of like helping you move your money around somewhat sketchily. Yeah, and very low interest rates, as I mentioned. But the thing that probably most people care about is the bank secrecy. And basically, what happens in Switzerland is that your relationship with a Swiss banker is similar to your like doctor-patient confidentiality. Uh, Everything, all of this stuff, let's say pre 2007. So yeah, it's like basically like a patient-doctor confidentiality where the bankers cannot like reveal anything about you, and this tradition is centuries old. It, like I said, the banking system started in like the 18th century. A lot of French noblemen used Swiss banks to like keep their money safe while like fleeing from France during the Revolution. And how they do this is like they started this concept of numbered bank accounts where your bank account isn't actually listed under a name but rather under just a number, and so you have to know the number in order to access the money. And so in 2013, the Swiss president defended bank secrecy and said, like, the state must absolutely respect the private sphere and should not know what there is in your bank account. Um, and so this like level of secrecy really got heightened. Like I said, it was very traditionally private, but it became like part of the law in 1934 through the Banking Act of 1934, and it was mainly to protect Jewish assets from the Nazis. Basically, Nazi Germany was kind of demanding Switzerland reveal the assets of any enemies of the German state that were in Swiss banks, and Switzerland basically put in this law. And what it did was privacy is statutorily enforced, where what that means is like not only are bankers like hesitant to like give up your privacy, it's actually like illegal for them to give up your privacy. Like they can be jailed if they give up your privacy. Once again, similar to like the whole doctor-patient situation that happens in the U.S. And the only way that you can a bank can reveal anything about their customers' accounts is through a Swiss judge's subpoena. So like that means any foreign authorities or even Swiss authorities could not go in and get information from the banks. And only laws that were illegal in Switzerland could be enforced through going through the Swiss judicial system. And one of the interesting things about the Swiss legal code is they actually draw a difference between tax fraud and tax evasion. And tax fraud is illegal in Switzerland, but tax evasion is not. And so basically in Switzerland, how it works is like you kind of voluntarily disclose all your own taxes. So that's why tax evasion is not illegal. And so that's why it kind of became a tax haven where, tax evasion is illegal in most countries like the US, but it wasn't illegal in Switzerland. So that way no one could, it wasn't illegal against Swiss laws. And so therefore, foreign country could not get a Swiss subpoena to access people's accounts. And so, they were very paranoid about the privacy. They avoided electronic transfers, and e-banking was, pretty forbidden in a lot of the private banks. And like, basically, this caused like a lot of things where like, if you wanted to get access to your account, everything was done very physically, like with physical keys and stuff. And this was so if you wanted to access your account, you'd have to usually go to Switzerland, or the Swiss bankers had to come to the United States, which causes a lot of issues down the road, which we'll get into. And like this kind of actually ended up being pretty, maybe the paranoia worked out because like post 2001, after 9/11, the U.S. government actually started to tap into the SWIFT database. SWIFT is like basically the system that international banking transfers are done through, and so the U.S. government had access to that. So it's kind of useful that they for a very privacy centric system, it's actually pretty useful that they tried to avoid electronic transfers as much as possible. So I'm going to play this clip from one of my favorite movies because why not?
Jordan Belfort, at last. Nicholas has told me so much about you.
Jordan, Jean-Jacques Sorel.
Pleasure to make your acquaintance.
Nice to meet you.
It's a joke. It's a joke.
You'll understand when you're in the fucking
Okay.
You need a bigger couch for
Yeah,
guests.
yeah. I don't understand. I'm sorry.
I'm curious about your bank secrecy laws here.
Wait. Yes. Excusez-moi, Jordan. Swiss custom requires 10 minutes of blah, blah, blah.
Chit-chat.
Yeah, chit-chat, thank you, before business can be discussed. Yeah. Of course. Let's get down to it. What would you like to know?
Under what circumstances would you be obligated to cooperate with an FBI or a U.S. Justice Department investigation, for example?
Ça dépend.
Ça dépend?
Oui.
Ça dépend on what exactly?
Whether America plans to invade Switzerland in the coming months.
So check if tanks are rolling down the Rue de la Croix, huh?
Yes, Rue de la Croix.
Croix.
La Croix.
Croix.
Not Croix, no, not Rue de la Croix. Croix.
See, this is what I used to do back in law school. Check me. Champagne, champagne.
Yeah.
Yeah. French fries. Bon fruit. And that kind of stuff.
That's fun.
What I'm asking you, Swiss dick, is are you going to fuck me over?
I understand perfectly, you American shit. The only way the Banque Reale de Genève would cooperate with a foreign legal party is if the crime being pursued is also a crime in Switzerland. But there are very few Swiss laws which apply to your practices. From a financial standpoint, you are now in heaven.
See, I told you he was fantastic, right?
If the U.S. Justice Department sent us a subpoena, it would become papier toilette. We would wipe our ass with it.
Unless, of course, it was an investigation into stock fraud, which is a crime here in Switzerland, if I'm correct. Then there would have to be cooperation on your part, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, we would. Assuming the account is under your name. If it were another name, a friend, a camarade,
Cousin?
cousin, absolument.
Relative.
Yeah.
Was that yodeling I just heard, or did you just say what I thought you said?
Yes.
He's telling me to use a fucking rat hole. But a U.S. rat hole would never get into Switzerland with all that money. What I needed was a rat hole with a European passport.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a fictional movie, but no, it's a real movie, fictional depiction of the movie. But most of that stuff is actually pretty true. Like with the stuff about if the crime is not illegal in Switzerland, they actually don't have to follow at all. And of course, the name. So in this case, there's different kinds of accounts. So in this one, it actually is linked to a name, but only within the private databases of the bank. Publicly, it's still associated as a number, and what the government can do is request if it is a crime in Switzerland, they can say, is this account linked to this person? And they can basically say yes or no. And since in this case he's basically forging it and using someone else's name, they could not. The bank just has to say no, and they can just the government can't do anything at that point. So as you can imagine, this quickly became very controversial. So almost as soon as it was created, in 1934, a lot of French politicians and bureaucrats started to move their money into Switzerland as a tax haven, and the French actually denounced this very quickly. They basically said so Switzerland, as we remember from the history lecture, Switzerland was lending money to Germany at the time. And so basically, it was very frowned upon in France at the time if you're putting your money in Swiss banks, because that money is basically ending up going to Germany, basically. And it ended up being used not only by tax evaders, but also dictators, terrorists, mobsters, arms dealers, corrupt officials, basically anyone who had money and didn't want it to be found. Even cases where people would put money in there to hide it from their spouses, so that way it didn't have to get split up in like divorce settlements and such. Another big controversy that happened that I think we touched on in the history lecture was the World Jurist Congress versus Swiss banks. This was a big controversy in the 1990s, where basically the World Jurist Congress alleged that the Swiss banks were holding stolen, like, so the Nazis would steal gold from the Jews during World War II and store it in Swiss banks, and basically that they've been using the money to fund their operations for a long time, and that it was pretty unethical. And the Swiss kind of really pushed back against this, and like the situation got much worse because the Swiss banks sort of started to like deny all these allegations, and so this became a very big, hot issue in the 1990s. And it ended up getting resolved with the Swiss bank gave $1.28 billion to the World Jurist Congress in return for the and then also relationships with the U.S. soured a lot because in 2011 it was found out that a Swiss bank was handling the finances for Al Qaeda prior to 9/11, so that also soured quite a bit of the and Switzerland would not let the U.S. like look into this financial records to try to trace origins and stuff. So this also soured relationships quite a bit. And then everything changed with this guy. Basically, what he did was, in 2007, he was a former UBS, one of the two big banks, banker who went to the Department of Justice and blew the whistle on the UBS aiding Americans to hide over $20 billion. Like, this guy is probably one of the most important whistleblowers, like, you've never heard of. And basically, he claimed that UBS was engaging in illegal cross-border banking, and, after a lot of stuff, UBS ended up being fined over $780 million. And the weird thing was that he himself was actually arrested in 2008 and sentenced to 40 months of prison. Basically, there's a whole story behind this that you can go and look up. But basically, they claim that he was like withholding information, like he was doing all this whistleblowing, but he was like not revealing the like shady stuff that he did, and so he got jail time for that, and spent a while in jail. But after he got out, he was awarded $104 million for his work as a whistleblower, because there's actually a law, the Tax Relief and Healthcare Act of 2006. Which basically said anyone who does whistleblowing on tax evasion can earn up to 30% of the revenue recouped by the IRS. And so, he was engaged in a very long lawsuit about this, and got quite a bit of money in the end. So this is some clips from an interview with him.
I'm the first one.
When Birkenfeld, a mid-level banker with an undistinguished employment history, knocked on the door of the U.S. Justice Department in the spring of 2007, he touched off an investigation that would threaten one of the world's largest banks with extinction and shake 300 years of Swiss banking secrecy to the foundations of its underground vaults. He did it by providing inside information and documentation that his former employer, banking giant UBS, was actively involved in helping its American clients defraud the U.S. Treasury out of billions of dollars in unpaid taxes.
What do you think was the most valuable thing that you gave to the U.S. government? The amount of clients and the amount of assets managed by UBS in the United States out of Switzerland.
And that was how much?
That was 19,000 clients and around 20 billion Swiss francs, which is about $19 billion.
Of the percentage of American accounts that you represented, how many would you say were trying to evade taxes?
My own clients. Mm-hmm. I would say about 90%.
Did people tell you this was their intention when they opened an account?
It was the unwritten rule. You didn't have to discuss it. People wouldn't fly all the way to Switzerland to open accounts just because they wanted to declare their money.
And as a private banker for UBS, Birkenfeld would help his clients invest, spend, and move their money. One example he told us about involved withdrawing cash from a customer's account, buying some diamonds in Geneva, and then smuggling them into the U.S. for the client inside a toothpaste tube. Birkenfeld claimed it was legal because the diamonds, he said, were worth less than $10,000 and didn't have to be declared at customs.
If it was legal, why did you put them in a toothpaste tube? That's why I'm having trouble with that.
Oh, no, it was just a way of carrying them so I wouldn't lose them. Where would you put two diamonds?
I think I'd put them in a money belt, or I think I'd put them in a case.
It was a one-time event. That's not my business. I just put them in a toothpaste tube.
You weren't trying to hide them from customs?
No, not at all.
Buying diamonds and other valuables is just one way of hiding and transporting assets, and Birkenfeld insists that he was just providing a service to his clients, which is what Swiss banking is all about.
People would ask you to make purchases for them, possibly maybe a car or a chalet, possibly a nice watch. So you would also cater to the client in that regard and then deliver it to them upon their choosing.
And what would be their choosing?
It could be in their hotel room, it could be in maybe another country, could be there in Geneva.
So you were sort of not just a banker, but also a personal shopper?
If you will, at a concierge level.
Birkenfeld claims his motives in going to the Justice Department were mostly altruistic. He offered to wear a wire to gather evidence against high-level UBS executives in exchange for full immunity for his transgressions. But the negotiations broke down, and Birkenfeld neglected to tell them about his dealings with this man, California real estate developer Igor Alenikov, who was his biggest client. Birkenfeld helped Alenikov hide $200 million by introducing him to a consultant who specialized in creating shell companies and sham entities that concealed the ownership of the UBS accounts.
I don't sign people's tax return, so what they do with their taxes is not my business. I'm a banker.
So you would steer them to somebody who would help them hide their money?
You would recommend them to these service providers, that's correct.
You must have known deep down that it was illegal.
When you came into the U.S., you felt uncomfortable, that's correct.
But as a gesture of goodwill, Birkenfeld did give the Justice Department, Senate investigators, IRS agents, and the SEC lots of information about UBS and its secret activities.
Any transaction that happened on an account was held deep in the vault and sealed until the client came to pick it up personally. Then they would either take it with them, which was generally not the case, or they would tell you to shred it, which we would do on behalf of the client.
People didn't have online accounts.
It was forbidden. E-banking was forbidden for U.S. clients.
They didn't get statements in the mail?
No.
So if somebody wanted to know how much money they had in the bank and how their investments were doing, they had to go to Switzerland?
Or maybe see their banker when they came to the U.S.
It was those visits to the U.S. which Birkenfeld told the government about that ultimately got UBS in so much trouble. The bank would sponsor lavish events like yacht races in Newport and the Art Basel Modern Art Festival in Miami Beach to attract wealthy Americans. Then it flew in its bankers from Switzerland to mingle and to try and drum up new clients and conduct business with existing ones. Because the Swiss bankers weren't licensed to conduct business in the United States, it was a clear violation of American banking laws on U.S. soil, and Birkenfeld provided internal documents that proved the length that UBS would go to in order to avoid detection.
Call it a vacation rather than a business trip, rather than saying, oh yes, I'm coming to see my private clients here in the United States, and I'm coming in from Zurich, Switzerland.
Did you bring records into the country with you when you came in?
Generally, no, I did not. My colleagues brought in encrypted laptops.
Encrypted laptops?
Yeah, so basically, like, this is kind of what ended up screwing over UBS in the end, was that he basically also, he gave a lot of evidence, including, like, of people, like, evading taxes and everything, but it was very hard for the DOJ to act on any of that because, this is, like, stolen evidence. But what the concrete evidence that the DOJ could act on directly was that UBS was basically, sending bankers to the United States to, like, deal with clients here and, like, help them here, basically. And that was illegal because you have to have a banking license to operate in the U.S. So that's kind of what they screwed UBS over for. And so, as you can tell, this guy, like, took down, like, got the U.S. like hundreds of millions of dollars, prevented a lot of tax fraud. And when he was, like, jailed for this, he was, I guess, reasonably pissed.
How much in tax revenue do you think you will have gained from this?
I've heard certainly the commissioner of the IRS say in the billions of dollars.
With the government claiming victory and UBS breathing a sigh of relief, the only person with grounds to be really unhappy is Bradley Birkenfeld, who the last time we saw him was wearing an electronic ankle bracelet, and the federal government had restricted his movements to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
I gave them the biggest tax fraud case in the world. I exposed 19,000 international criminals. And I'm going to jail for that?
As it turns out, while the U.S. government was using Birkenfeld's information to go after UBS, the Justice Department was closing in on his biggest client, Igor Alenikov, for tax evasion. Alenikov cooperated with the investigation and paid $52 million in fines and back taxes and got off with no jail time. But because Birkenfeld hadn't told prosecutors about his relationship with Alenikov, Birkenfeld was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit tax fraud. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 40 months in prison, and he was not happy about it.
And you think that you should not be going to jail,
I think I shouldn't.
even though you violated the law and you were an enabler. I mean, you were the person who were implementing these policies.
And I'm the only one going to prison. Out of 19,000 accounts and no Swiss bankers?
If he had come forward and told us everything that he knew, a complete and accurate picture in the summer of 2007, we think it's likely he wouldn't have been prosecuted.
Mr. Birkenfeld says that the federal government admits that the prosecutions would not have been successful without his participation in this, and yet he is the only one that is going to jail. Is that fair?
It is not uncommon.
There's some more stuff.
Welcome back. Tom Hartman here with you, and I'm really pleased to have in the studio with me Bradley.
So he ended up releasing like this book last year.
So you turned these 19,000 illegal accounts over to the U.S. government. They only pursued 4,700 of them. They recovered $15 billion. They wrote you a check for over $100 million before taxes. But they also threw you in prison.
That's correct. And they scapegoated me. The Department of Justice, as I've said time and time again, if the Olympics were passing out awards for corruption, the DOJ would win gold, silver, and bronze. These guys are really the problem within this country. As we always say, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. They're certainly not part of the solution, which makes them the problem.
At least when it comes to banks.
Well, not only banks, but other justice incidents where they're not pursuing justice. These people are actually looking out for their own interests so they can develop their resume, and then they go into the private sector, the old revolving door.
It's the revolving door. This is what has corrupted virtually every major agency of our government.
That's precisely correct, Tom. And I saw it firsthand. How is it possible that the one courageous guy that came in and exposed the largest and longest running tax fraud in U.S. history was the only one to go to jail?
That would be you.
That's me. And
what happened to the people that you worked for? This letter that you sent over to the president this morning, you said, why did the DOJ release from custody two of the most senior UBS executives who oversaw this massive fraud?
That's
Why?
correct. Well, this is the problem. The DOJ has their hands dirty. The American people should be indicting the DOJ because what they've in fact done is they've hushed all of this, because if those people started mentioning names of CEOs, Hollywood movie stars, politicians who had accounts at UBS, you would have an uproar in this country.
Do you feel, if you know the names of some of these people, do you feel like you're walking around with a target on your back?
Not at all. I'm going to expose them at some point. So these people have to understand, you played this game for far too long, and you think that I'm the only one going to go down with this ship? Not going to happen.
Wow.
Yeah, because I want to expose, I took on the biggest bank in the world, UBS. Now I'm taking on the biggest government in the world, the DOJ.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what's the plan?
Well, the plan is my book is coming out tonight. I'm doing a book launch.
And by the way, for people in Washington, D.C., you're going to be over the national press.
Yeah, basically he's like, he wrote a book on his experiences with doing this last year, and he's like really upset with the U.S. government on how they handled it, and so I don't know. At least we're declaring war on the DOJ now as well. So see what happens with that. Yeah, I mean, after the UBS got caught for this whole scandal in 2008, basically after that the U.S. along with like many other countries in the G20 and OECD basically pressured Switzerland into abolishing distinction between tax fraud and tax evasion. Only for foreign clients, though. This was back in like 2009, I want to say. But basically, they had to reveal for foreign clients if someone is doing something tax evading and reveal their information. And the U.S. was kind of bringing down the hammer on this, and basically threatening with sanctions and all sorts of things. So I guess from the clip, the U.S. doesn't need to send tanks down the road. The U.S. can extend its economic power to get what it wants, basically. The past few years has just been sort of been this continuous push of Switzerland being forced to decrease its privacy laws. In 2013, they were passed a law that aligned Swiss bank practices with other countries, which basically means that a lot of the privacy stuff did go away. Basically, most when a foreign country asked to see records, they would show it to them. And then in 2015, they signed an agreement with the EU that both will do automatic exchange of information on each other's residents starting in 2018. So starting next year, basically what the difference between that is before next year, if the EU, for example, wants to investigate someone they believe is doing tax fraud, they have to basically ask the Swiss banks, basically can you give us this person's records? But now, starting in 2018, any EU citizen that has money in Swiss banks, vice versa, that data gets automatically transferred. So now it will make it much easier to find anyone tax evading. So, it doesn't have to be that the governments are looking for it. They can now data scrape all of this and find all the tax evaders. And they're building similar bilateral agreements with other countries such as the U.S., India, Australia. And because of that, there's a large shift in secret banking towards Singapore and to a little bit of a lesser extent Hong Kong. Singapore mostly has a lot of these same privacy laws as Switzerland. So Singapore's economy has been doing pretty well because of that. Here's a quick video.
Two of the world's largest banks have come under scrutiny in the last few years for alleged unscrupulous business practices in Switzerland. So what shady things have these banks been accused of, and how does it affect you? Well, first of all, a Swiss banking law in 1934 made it a criminal act for banks to reveal the name of its account holders. This came in handy for Jews during World War II, when they were able to hide funds from the Nazis. But the banks have since become an infamous tax haven for the global elite. The UBS, or the United Bank of Switzerland, and the London-based HSBC, short for the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, are some of the world's largest banks which have benefited from the 1934 law. UBS accounts and Swiss HSBC accounts have been held by the internationally wealthy, including many celebrities, politicians, royalty, corporate executives, and families with old money. It's safe to say that both banks have had their share of run-ins with the law over the years. The UBS and other Swiss banks were accused in the 1990s of keeping unclaimed World War II wealth to themselves, including things stolen by the Nazis. And in the 2000s, the UBS, the HSBC, and their affiliates were required to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in restitutions and penalties for unsavory business practices. These infractions have included mis-selling products to elderly customers, lending bank names and logos to fraudulent pension funds, being involved in the Enron collapse, and a huge Ponzi scheme that cost investors $600 million. Lately, because of whistleblowers from inside the HSBC and the USB, authorities have been made aware of alleged tax evasion schemes created by the banks themselves in order to help their clients hide money. Tax evasion can negatively affect the majority of the world while benefiting an elite minority. Regular taxpayers like you and me need to chip in more money to compensate for tax evaders. A 2012 report from the Tax Justice Network estimates that conservatively, between $21 and $32 trillion goes unreported from the world's wealthiest people, money which is stored in tax havens like the ones allegedly offered by certain Swiss banks. The UBS says that it has since amended its policies and takes regulator accusations very seriously. The HSBC maintains a similar sentiment and reports that it has refocused and reevaluated business practices. Many other banks have also settled with government regulators for huge sums of money, and they pledged to do better. Back in 2011, a G20 summit report declared that the era of bank secrecy is over. However, with the recent Swiss bank controversies, it appears that's not the case. Corporations have also found ways to avoid paying their taxes as well. To learn about one such loophole, check out our video here.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of got like a lot of people were happy about the Switzerland releasing information, but a lot of people, especially within Switzerland, were very upset about this. They said it kind of went against the whole strong on privacy stance that they took, that Switzerland is supposed to take, like a comic of someone holding up the bank and instead of giving up the money, which they would have, the banks would have had to. They are more willing to give up the information of their customers. Yeah. Okay. And so it's been actually quite. A lot of the banking system has had to change. Credit Suisse has been doing a lot to modify how they, approach banking. This is a cool video.
Geneva might be considered one of the smallest financial capitals in the world, but it's among the leaders when it comes to financial trading and offshore asset management. Besides private Geneva bankers, it's also home to branches of the biggest international financial institutions. Until recently, not many questions were asked when rich clients brought their money to these classy addresses to avoid the tax authorities. Business was thriving until data theft cases, like the one involving HSBC, brought the extent of tax dodging to the surface. For Yves Mirabeau, president of the bank bearing his name, data thief Hervé Falciani shouldn't be considered the person who buried banking secrecy.
The real reason was the desire of countries to look for new sources of income as a consequence of the 2008 financial crisis to cover their own deficits.
Because of the zeal of the states in need, everything went much faster than bankers and tax specialists could have ever expected.
We were all taken aback. In 2009, bankers believed if they handed over information upon request, they wouldn't be troubled again for another 10 to 15 years. But what happened afterwards was a tsunami, and as a result, we now have the automatic exchange of information in place.
These changes have left their mark on Geneva as a financial centre. In 2005, there were 145 active banks, and today there are only 119. It's worth noting that over the same period, the number of employees in the sector has increased from 16,644 to 18,855. This is a consequence of the fact that it's now more demanding to check the tax history of clients. Nonetheless, the new clean money policy hasn't led to a drop in the amount of assets under management. Geneva's reputation remains intact.
There is more money flowing in than out. The number of managed assets went up, despite the difficult situation on the markets, despite the decision of the National Bank to remove the franc peg to the euro, which was a big blow to our clients. In spite of everything, we're seeing an upward trend.
Geneva as a financial centre was shaken by the HSBC affair, but thanks to the radical change of course, it's maintained its leading position in asset management.
Yep. I'll skip this video, but it's basically about how a lot of the banks that the large banks that were engaging in a lot of aiding and abetting tax evasion, a lot of them went under. So a lot of smaller banks that didn't have the access and resources to do this kind of stuff, they actually started doing pretty well. And I'll talk a little bit now away from the private banks, but more towards the National Bank of Switzerland, the Swiss National Bank, which is the central bank of Switzerland. And it acts, it's actually very similarly run as the United States Federal Reserve. Has a very great deal of autonomy from the government. It's supposed to control inflation. That's its directive given to it by Parliament. It is privately owned, but unlike the U.S. Federal Reserve, it's actually publicly traded, which is kind of pretty cool, I guess. About 45% of the shares are held by cantonal governments, 15% by member banks, but 40% is actually owned by private individuals, and you can buy it on the there's a small Swiss stock exchange in Bern, and you can actually buy it on the stock exchange. which is kind of pretty cool. Yeah, this is a video explaining it. Oops, this one was out of place. I went to put this after the privacy stuff, so, Swiss franc privacy is not that great, so you can talk about that later if you want. Yeah, so, actually, it is true, though, that a lot of investment into Bitcoin was going in right around the same time as privacy laws in Switzerland were enacted. Yeah, anyways, so one of the most interesting things about the central bank in the past few years was this, experiment that they did that kind of failed pretty spectacularly. And so what they did was they tried to do a currency peg with the euro. And so the reason of this is that the Swiss franc is often seen as a safe haven, and basically what that means is when there's a downturn in the global economy, a lot of money starts to go into the Swiss franc, which causes the Swiss franc to appreciate heavily. But now, okay, I don't want to go. Okay, does anyone have any? So, when a currency starts to appreciate too much, the value of that currency goes up quite a bit, and that actually makes exports more expensive for that country. Does anyone want me to go over the monetary policy of how that works? Okay, basically, yeah, your prices become much more expensive as opposed to other people's, as opposed to other countries, and so customers will usually go ahead and buy from the other country, and the amount that people are buying from you goes down quite a bit. Note that this is only in nominal sense. The nominal exchange rate changes, but the real exchange rate should not actually change. But the problem is that prices are sticky, and so it actually takes a few years for the real exchange rate to adjust to the change in prices. And so back in 2011, and so the thing is, Switzerland is a massively exporting nation. And so when this was happening, so in 2009, when the global recession just started, 2011 when the Eurozone crisis started happening, the franc was appreciating very heavily as opposed to the euro, which was going up in value a lot, which is usually a good thing, but not if you're a heavily exporting nation. And for this reason, the franc was deflating too much relative to other currencies, and exports were starting to cut off. And so in 2011, what they did was they set a peg of 1 euro to 1.2 francs. They actually didn't set a peg. What they did was they set a minimum. So 1 euro couldn't go below 1.2 francs. That was the minimum exchange rate that you could have. It allowed it to go up, but because the push was up downwards, it kind of got stuck at that point. And the problem with this is that the euro, the EU, the Eurozone kind of kept inflating their currency more and more and more. And in order to keep this 1.2 peg, what Switzerland had to do was keep inflating their money supply, because otherwise they wouldn't be, the peg would get lost. And so the two ways of doing this is you can print money, which they did do a little bit of, but that doesn't. The proper way to do it is you have to. I don't want to go too much into the economics of it, but basically what they ended up having to buy more and more foreign currency. By 2014, they ended up buying over $480 billion of foreign currency to keep in reserves so that they could issue more of their own currency. And this $480 billion is 70% of their GDP. And so things were getting better around 2014, 2015, but then they kind of crashed again, where you had the Russia-Ukraine crisis. A lot of the BRICS countries started, their economy started doing much worse. Oil prices crashed around this time. And once again, the Swiss franc was seen as a safe haven again, and a lot of money started rushing into that, so the peg kind of got pushed out again. And, the EU was planning on doing another round of quantitative easing, which is basically inflating it even further. And so at this point, Switzerland could not handle the force of the peg, basically. They couldn't just keep inflating their money supply to match the euro. And so what they did was in January of 2015, they ended up cutting the peg. And within, the franc appreciated over 30% in one day. That's the relative price of the euro as compared to one franc, and that's like all in one day. It had a massive spike, and what this did was Swiss exports became 10% more expensive. It cut Swiss economic growth from 1.8% in 2014 to 0.6% in 2015. They're starting to get into recovery now. As of this year, the projected growth rate is 0.9%. So things are starting to get a little bit better, but they're faced with a very hard problem due to factors out of their control. Because the euro is doing poorly, they have to choose either between lower growth rate or high inflation. I'll play this video. Maybe this can explain it a little bit better than I can.
In 2008, the banking crash plunged several countries into stagnation or recession. Investors sought refuge for their remaining assets. Enter the safe haven Swiss franc. The euro and the dollar were abandoned. This had a dramatic impact on exchange rates. Which was great for Swiss people holidaying in Europe, but made it harder for Swiss resorts to attract Europeans. The prices of Swiss goods also rose, making exports less competitive. The Swiss National Bank took action. It printed Swiss francs and used them to buy euros. This, they hoped, would stop the franc from gaining too much against the euro. But things only got worse. Several European countries were having difficulties paying off their enormous state debts. And so, the euro remained a weak currency. This time, the Swiss National Bank set a minimum exchange rate of 1 franc 20 to the euro. That sent foreign currency investments skyrocketing to over 430 billion francs. That left the central bank open to criticism for being too unstable and risky. Fast forward to the start of 2014. Europe finally seemed to be leaving its problems behind it, and the US economy was recovering too. But along came the Ukraine-Russia conflict. To make matters worse, the emerging economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa were cooling off while oil prices were declining rapidly. What happened next? The European Central Bank hinted it would spend hundreds of billions of euros to buy government debt of weaker states. The franc as a safe haven was once again in the spotlight. In January 2015, the Swiss National Bank sent out a bolt from the blue. It abandoned its minimum exchange rate with the euro, sending the two currencies to virtual parity. It was the end of the bank's experiment with a minimum exchange rate. And the franc remains a safe haven with unknown consequences for the Swiss economy.
This video is just like a news clip, but basically a bunch of people are like freaking out about this, especially because there's the Swiss stock market sort of crashed that day as well. A lot of companies were like freaking out. It was a pretty poor day for anyone who was investing in Switzerland when the peg broke. So I'm almost out of time, so I'll skip this stuff. That's it for today, I guess. I'll send out questions for the homework over email, and also final papers. So I'll let you guys choose. It was brought up to me that because this is a class on Switzerland, we should democratically choose whether or not to do a final paper or not. and I'm going to say no to that. But I will let you guys democratically choose whether or not to have a final paper or a final exam. And I think that's somewhat fair. Unless you guys do a referendum, then I can't overpower that. But yeah, just like send me, along with the homework, just send me a like, would you rather have a final paper or a final exam? And I'll do that. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it this next week or the week
Oh,
after?
right. I'm not going to be, no class next week. So it's the following week. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. That was the attendance link.